Can I get one of the mics? Oh, right here. Sorry, it's a bit of the Anna show this morning. I wasn't really planning on that, but I do have some things to say also about slightly less LLM-y, super hot and interesting cutting-edge research, because part of the stuff that we've been doing at Wageningen University, where I'm doing my postdoc, is much more sort of basic stuff that I think if you did this 10 years ago here at AMLD, people would think, oh, actually already 5 years old, but it still performs well. 15 years later, still okay, which is topic modeling, right? And in this case, topic modeling specifically of United Nations environmental initiatives. There's quite a few of these. And in recent years, for topics like food and water, as well as climate, which is why we're all here, what these environmental initiatives have started to do is stock taking, which doesn't mean much by itself, right? But in this case, what they try to do in the stock taking exercise is just get a bunch of people together to submit all the documents that they have, all their viewpoints on a given topic. So for example, the global stock take under the Paris Agreement resulted in a few tens of thousands of pages submitted mostly by governments, but also by, for example, the IPCC, a bunch of NGOs. For the Food Systems Summit, there are mostly government reports, and then for the water one, we also have a lot of companies who were submitting these kinds of documents. In all of these cases, what you get is a data set that's very large, very diverse, and often also in multiple languages, which is the case for all of these three examples, which for normal topic modeling is a bit of a problem. Luckily, Google Translate exists, right? So even if you are using something that is, as I said, 20-something years old, like an NMF or an LDA, if you just run it through Google Translate, you still get decent results. And that's what we ended up doing for the water topic. But also, BERT can be run in a sort of multilingual setting. So in this case, we created multilingual embeddings for the food and for the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. And in all of these cases, which I really want to stress here, what we wanted was a fairly critical look, right? We didn't want to just describe this is what people are talking about. We wanted to investigate something specific. So in most cases, this is more like academic critiques. For water, it's, for example, a lot around sort of corporate capture. What are these companies that are invited actually saying when it comes to water access, when quite often they're honestly part of the problem, right? For food, it was in some sense the opposite critique. It's just governments, and all of these governments, it's blah, blah, right? They submit reports that no one really wants to read and that don't actually have a lot of sort of substantive impact. And then for climate, we actually had a more interesting case in some sense in that they have an official summary already out there, right? So they had these tens of thousands of pages, and then they created a summary document that's 50 pages. We don't know what happened in the interim. We don't know where those topics are coming from. How they decided on it is largely a political process, not one that's actually driven by the input. So, excuse me if I run through these results very quickly. That's what you get when you do 3 tiny research projects in one presentation. For water, one of the main findings for us is that actually it is true that corporate people talk about very different things from, let's say, NGOs, but also from governments. So this is sort of a grouping of the different topics that came out of the topic model, and you clearly see here vulnerability and inclusion. If you look at where the shade is, that's massively overrepresented in NGO submissions, right? But not at all in the government or the private sector, who care much more about energy topic, agriculture topics, stuff where the money's at, right? We can see why. For food, again, we find that the academic criticisms fairly well represented in what we actually see in the data. Remember, the academic criticism here was these documents don't actually say much. And it turns out, if you try to figure out, are they pushing some kind of political agenda? Maybe, but if they're doing it, they're not doing a very good job, right? Because even if you plot all of these topic clusters to their food severity index or their food malnutrition index, it's barely correlated with anything. And in fact, what we see for food insecurity is that the correlation is inverse from what you might expect, meaning countries that have more food insecurity talk about it less. For climate, it's the opposite. This clearly is a very politicized arena. The global stocktake documents are not neutral representations of reality. Even though that's really what they're meant to be, they're meant to give you an overview of what's happening on climate. They're all regional priorities. But these regional priorities are not reflected at all in the outcome document. And that's kind of strange if you think about it as if the outcome document should just be a summary of the inputs, but it's not so strange when you think about it in a political sense. Because the global stocktake, the clue is in the name, was meant to be global, so the only mandate they had was to include globally relevant topics. Everything that's country-specific, even though that's apparently what the countries care about, is left out entirely. And these peaks here, and non-party stakeholders, that's almost all of them are IPCC reports. And so we see that IPCC reports are quoted verbatim quite often in the outcome technical summary. So for us, what's then the conclusion? For climate, really, what's the point? If we have tens of thousands of documents, we go through this whole rigmarole, we ask people to send things, and then what we end up with is a summary report that looks like the existing summary reports that we had already. I'm not so sure that that's time well spent, right? Also, for stock taking, we really need to take into account that in some cases, stakeholders might be pushing their own agenda. So even though this is meant to be providing an overview, really what it's doing is providing people a space to push whatever they want, right? Which means that this self-reporting is not really a reliable way of going about things. However, I don't want to slag it off too much, right? It is still a very rich data set. All of these three examples, if you go in and you have an idea in mind of what kind of project you want to set up, chances are there's useful knowledge in there. It's just that you need to find it yourself. On the more technical side of things, broadly speaking, we could say this works. We find politically meaningful topics, even if we're using NMF with Google Translate, which is a setup we could have used 20 years ago, right? Still works, still finding politically fairly meaningful topics that substantiate criticisms from academics and experts. Per topic, however, we found more of a pain to use because it's basically a stack of different fairly advanced algorithms, each of which you can tune, and it's not exactly always clear how the different hyperparameters interact with each other. But the multilingual embedding spaces do work and remove the need for translation. And overall, we find that this is most useful if you start combining these sort of fairly basic methods with other types of metadata and with questions that are, let's say, inquisitive and critical and based on theory. So, if you only take one thing away from this, it should be this, I think. Even simple machine learning can help quantify outcomes in global stock taking, and I think broadly as well, right? There's a lot of these data sets. No one's ever used them before for any kind of inquiry, so don't be afraid to just try a simple thing. And especially pay attention to, let's say, relatively small topics, topics that might be pushed by different types of actors. For the stock taking, in particular, we see if you invite NGOs, right, if you invite non-governmental organizations to submit their views as well, you get a very different data set. You get much diverser opinions, and they tend to represent especially the Global South, right? Which, for a lot of these processes, is direly needed. But even if you have all this, right, which they did for the global stocktake, it's no substitute for political courage. If you want there to be outcomes, you need to get the policymakers on side. Otherwise, you get a technical summary that doesn't really represent anyone. That's it from me. While I have a quick drink, you can think on a question.
Thank you. And are there any also initiatives to include more like indigenous people, like impacts and more local knowledge as well?
Yeah, absolutely. There are, especially at sort of UN kind of fora. I will say that when it comes to documentation, that tends to be quite difficult. So for these purely sort of text-based things, it's actually quite difficult to get these voices represented if they don't then make an official submission somehow, which sometimes can be a problem because who has the time for it, honestly, right? Especially when it comes to things like oral histories, there's also people who say, well, actually there's a point to it being oral, right? Which is in the process of the telling, it's not just the text, it's not just the words that are spoken, but it's also how they are said that we can't really represent in these kinds of models quite clearly, right? But yeah, there are quite a few initiatives, and I'd like to see them, you know, pop up in these kinds of models more. One more question?
Great talk. I have a technical question. So, crawling the UNFCCC database is horrible. Is there, like, you didn't use any API, but many of these things are like in different languages, as you said, but also SPDF format. What was your data pipeline to process that?
You're sitting next to them in part. So for the global stocktake, this was by far the largest data set, but Climate Policy Radar has released the data set publicly of all the global stocktake submissions. It's on Hugging Face somewhere. We did end up re-downloading most of the documents because we were working on this project at the same time that they were processing all the PDFs. So the text extraction for us was, you know, fairly standard PDF to text, just Python package. But the stuff that's out there now on the Hugging Face repository, I think, is a bit better than even what we had there. For the water action agenda, they just have a CSV for a change. So, you know, that one was fairly easy. And for the food system topics, because the documents were very long, but there weren't actually that many. There were, I think, 150 or so submissions. So we could just download them manually. And so I wanted to build a web scraper. And by the time I'd built the web scraper, the person who I was doing the project with, who's not at all a tech person, said, here's the folder. Right? Because I agree with you. And actually, this is quite a big point for the United Nations and sort of similar organizations. If you want your data to be used, make it easy to get, right? So I'm not sure how many data providers there are here. I think data users are by far overrepresented at AMLD. But I agree with you. Building these kinds of web scrapers yourselves is quite often quite a difficult process. Yeah.